All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started as we have a busy session today. So hello, good afternoon, and or morning to some on the West Coast. Welcome to the Upward Mobility Framework Overview Workshop, introducing local leaders to the Upward Mobility Framework. My name is Will Engelhart with the Urban Institute, and I'm a Senior Training and Technical Assistance Manager here with our Justice Policy Center. Today, myself and my colleagues, Gabby Velasco and Arzo Azizi, are going to be presenting on the Upward Mobility Framework, as you see here with our agenda. So for today's agenda, first, I'm going to go over the history and development of the Upward Mobility Framework. And then after I do so, towards the end of my slides, we're going to have a very brief interactive exercise for you all. So please come ready to engage with us in about 10 minutes or so. And we'll prompt you, of course, when the time comes. Then after that section, Gabby is going to provide an overview of the Upward Mobility Framework and the mobility metric data tables. Followed by that, Arzo is going to talk about ways that the framework has been used in communities and localities, and also provide some guidance regarding available resources and forthcoming trainings related to the Upward Mobility Framework. Finally, we'll leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. And for that, regarding some housekeeping items, before the question and answer time, we just ask that folks stay on mute throughout the presentation if you can, but welcome folks to drop any questions that come up in the chat. The chat function will be monitoring and we'll make sure to address them. Once it's time for the question and answer period, if folks want to raise hands using the raise hand function, we can call on people to ask questions directly, and feel free to come off mute at that time, or you could still put questions in the chat if you prefer. And then finally, you may have seen the notice, but this is being recorded and it will be shared out afterwards. So just take note of that as well. Thanks so much. Great. So, excuse me. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about a brief history of the development of the Upward Mobility Framework. So as you see here on the slide, the Upward Mobility Framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was a convening of 24 leading voices representing academia, practitioners, the faith community, philanthropy, community stakeholders, and the private sector. It was convened by the Urban Institute with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the partnership asked the question, as you see here, what would it take to dramatically and sustainably increase mobility from poverty? The aim of this partnership was to gather research and evidence to coalesce around a shared answer to this question, and resulted in some notable findings, which you see here. So the key finding of this group was that mobility is about more than just economic success. True upward mobility requires that people have power and autonomy and a sense of being valued by their community, along with economic success. So to move out of poverty and stay out of poverty, people also need to feel that they have power and autonomy in their lives, meaning the ability to make choices and influence actions that affect their future, and that they are valued in the community and can contribute to it. This broader conception of mobility from poverty, as you see here, that again includes economic success, equally with power, autonomy, and a sense of community belonging, is what we refer to at Urban as the three-part definition of mobility from poverty. And it drives our current work and the current upward mobility framework. Before moving on from the three-part definition, I wanted to spend just a moment discussing how structural racism impacts upward mobility and this definition. For most people experiencing poverty in the United States today, opportunities to achieve greater economic success, power, autonomy, and dignity are blocked by longstanding structural barriers, not by failure of individual efforts or individual programs or services. Many of these barriers have resulted from and are perpetuated by racist beliefs, norms, policies, and practices, and have deep and persistent inequities across the United States. For a quick example, the practice of redlining, which is denying mortgage loans to certain neighborhoods or areas deemed high risk based on race, ethnicity, immigration status as well, for the people living there, created stark racial disparities that persist to this day, specifically in home ownership, wealth building, and school funding, and ultimately someone's ability to achieve economic success in particular. Barriers to home ownership can also impact someone's ability to feel that they have control over their life, to make the choices they want to make, of course. Home ownership barriers can also make it difficult for people to feel valued in their neighborhoods and connected to their neighbors. This is especially true if their inability to buy a home leads them to move more frequently and not have deep roots to their neighborhood. Simply put, structural racism can't be ignored and must be acknowledged when thinking about ways to combat barriers to upward mobility. But moving to our next steps coming out of the three-part definition, after it was created, a lot of people came to Urban saying, this is great, the three-part definition is great, it resonates with us a lot, but what does it actually look like in practice? How do you implement it? So us being a research organization at Urban, we began a research project to identify successful interventions that had achieved all three parts of the definition of participants, for participants, excuse me. We looked specifically for interventions that had rigorous evidence of economic success, meaning that they demonstrated that improved economic outcomes, and then also looked to that they demonstrated strong intentionality in improving power, autonomy, and being valued in community. Coming out of that process, we selected 6 programs with this rigorous evidence, the names listed here, which I won't go through. And just one note before moving on to this next slide, but it's fine to keep it up. I just wanted to talk about the exemplars research a bit more, in that initially we had hoped to have this research go broader than just talking about programs or focusing on programs that embody the three-part definition. However, in practice, some of the criteria and evidence we used for selection pushed Urban to focus on programs rather than social movements or systems changes and processes, which was a limitation of the scope of the research. This is because programs alone, no matter how effective they are unlikely to fully break down the social and systemic barriers that prevent people from achieving mobility from poverty and from achieving equity within our and their communities. This is because programs are no match for the larger entrenched structural forces working at the government, economic, societal, and structural levels, as I just mentioned previously. But bringing us, excuse me, to this next slide, or this slide that we're on, we just wanted, sorry, if you could go back to the previous slide, thanks. We just wanted to quickly summarize some of the common attributes across all 6 of the programs that contribute to outcomes related to economic success, power, and autonomy, and belonging. All 6 exemplars intentionally offer some sort of, some form of material assistance to participants as a means of reducing stress and generating momentum on the path to economic success. For example, one program provided cash incentives, another program provided housing vouchers, another program provided transit subsidies. Also, all the exemplars emphasize practices and strategies that develop human capital in the form of high quality education, educational supports, advocacy opportunities for participants or career training specifically. And then participants and staff at each program stress the importance of individual choice in determining service delivery. Staff often spoke of coaching and using evidence-based approaches such as motivational interviewing to encourage participants to define and pursue the goals that matter most to them. And then, of course, building in elements of choice into the programs provides participants the ability to build power and autonomy. And then finally, every exemplar placed heavy emphasis on building family-like relationships among participants and also between participants and staff as well. Staff across the programs describe the building up of strengths over deficits and creating a climate of acceptance within the programs as necessary to the success of the participants. So moving on to the next slide. We don't have a ton of time today to dive deeper into the exemplars, but I see that Katie put in the chat the report itself, which is up on the screen, and we want to point you to this report as it discusses the attributes of each program that I just very briefly touched on that contributed to outcomes related to economic success, power and autonomy, and belonging. It's up on our website as well, which you can get at the reports tab under the Upward Mobility website. And so switching gears a little bit, I'm coming to that exercise, which I mentioned previously. So before I pass it to Gabby to talk through some next steps related to the upward mobility framework, we want to just take a few minutes to hear from you all. So using this Mentimeter code that should be put in the chat, hopefully, I think, we're hoping folks could spend a minute or two just to share one word that describes a challenge that you're facing with regards to addressing upward mobility. If you can't access the Menti link, feel free to drop your one word in the chat. But if you click on the link, it should take you to a place to enter the words that you think describe a challenge your community is facing. And there's the link in the chat in addressing upward mobility. So please just click that link and follow the prompt to entering one word that you think is a challenge your community experiences with regards to addressing upward mobility. When I see there is a code you must enter too. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Mike, for putting affordable healthcare and education in the chat. And Emily putting roadblocks, housing. I'm assuming some folks are able to access the link as well, hopefully. There we go. And Menti does a cool thing where it creates this little word cloud of some of the words folks are putting in. And housing has come up several times in the chat and also comes up certainly here on Menti. Racism, trust, time, housing costs also comes up. Some others in the chat putting legal system involvement, lack of social capital, roadblocks, empathy. Time is an interesting one. Education, childcare, good paying jobs, transportation, honesty, resource challenged, history, someone put in chat. Thank you all so much. Yeah, that's all really interesting and reflective of the challenges we're facing in terms of some specific ones and then some really broad ones as well. And so I'll be passing it over to my colleague Gabby to talk more about the development of the upward mobility framework, provide a brief overview of the framework itself, and hopefully provide some insights to you all on addressing some of these really big challenges. We might not have all the answers, but can provide some guidance on ways to address them. Gabby?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will. Hi, everybody. My name is Gabby Velasco. I'm a policy associate in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. And I'm excited to share some background on the development of the upward mobility framework, and then also walk through the framework itself with y'all. So moving along, after the partnership concluded in 2018, our project was created with the goal of supporting communities in creating the conditions that increase upward mobility from poverty and that narrow racial and ethnic inequities for children, youth, and adults. We started with a focus on metrics, and we recognize that although it can take decades to measure generational mobility, local leaders need actionable information to help guide their decision-making in both the short and the medium term. So we were set with the charge of developing a comprehensive but concise, and that's a hard balance, set of metrics that could be used to support communities across the country and change makers across sectors. In 2019, we partnered with a cross-disciplinary working group of scholars who systematically reviewed factors that research shows affect long-term mobility from poverty and which could be influenced by local and state policies. This work was refined over multiple years through testing and partnership with 8 counties, whose work I'll talk about more in a moment, as well as additional research and feedback from several organizations and communities. In partnership with the working group and using all that feedback we collected, we have the current version of the upward mobility framework that drives our project and this presentation that we're sharing with you all today. So from 2020 to 2022, as part of a process to test the utility of both the framework and the metrics for local decision makers, We partnered with a set of 8 county governments across the country and their cross-sector community coalitions, which we call the Upward Mobility Cohort. Coming out of this approach, we recognize that the mobility metrics themselves are a really key starting point, but that improving the conditions that support mobility and equity in communities takes a lot more than just that data. Successful change requires coalition building with partners across sectors and policy domains. It requires deep, meaningful community engagement. It also requires the addition of local data and other sources of knowledge to supplement the metrics and provide a more full, nuanced understanding of the conditions in a community. And also, we discovered through that engagement that a systems change focus is really essential to integrate with the framework so that we're engaging with the root causes of inequity. We've learned so much more from that cohort than I have time to speak to today, but we want to provide a few reflections on how that partnership with the counties influenced our approach to racial equity. First, it really drove home how equity needs to be embedded in every step of the work. Our counties really embraced the fact that racial equity is not just an outcome or a way of engaging with data, but it's a process. And to that end, data disaggregation is a really good starting point, but it's also not an end point in this work. And to that point, it's also important to think about communities who are likely to be either underrepresented or missing from some metrics data, like undocumented Americans or people experiencing housing instability. And to measure and begin addressing equity, we need to not just consider the magnitude of current disparities, but also really commit to structural analyses of history and relations to power to account for the source of those disparities. Many cohort members conducted root cause analyses to jumpstart this process. Finally, another central way our county partners built equity into the process of local mobility work is through community engaged methods. So these strategies, which can occur throughout the lifespan of a project, center residents with lived experience of intergenerational poverty and structural racism in both setting priorities and understanding the impact of interventions. Some of the strategies our partners used include data walks, community advisory boards, and community engaged survey methods. And so to that end, you may ask, what is the Upward Mobility Framework? So I'm going to walk through each component of our framework and then the suite of mobility metrics to kind of help y'all understand what these mean, how they all fit together. So on the screen is a visual of our Upward Mobility Framework. You'll see at the top there is upward mobility from poverty, because that is, of course, our primary driving goal. And then every part of the framework below that is the structural support for that goal. Let's get into these structures. We start with the interconnected 3-part definition of mobility from poverty that I just showed you: economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity and belonging. And those are the 3 components that holistically represent upward mobility. Then, supporting mobility from poverty and that 3-part definition are 5 essential pillars. So the first pillar is opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. Neighborhoods play a really central role in supporting family stability and well-being, their access to social and economic opportunity, and their children's chances to thrive and succeed. High-quality education is another pillar. So from preschool through post-secondary, education provides a crucial avenue to economic and social mobility. Third is rewarding work. As we all know, jobs and wages constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people in the US today. We also include a healthy environment and access to good healthcare. The research shows that good and stable health helps people of all ages surmount life's challenges, excel in school and on the job, ensure their family's well-being, and also just fully participate in their communities. And our 5th pillar is responsive and just governance. So that's when the community is attentive to the needs of all residents, and community members who are engaged in decision-making are engaged throughout the process. So not just as a one-off, but really have a voice throughout that process. And then across the pillars is a key foundation. Ensure equitable access for all, including people of color and other marginalized groups. as Will shared, and then I shared a bit earlier, combating persistent racial inequities across the pillars is really central to achieving any kind of upward mobility in communities. So this emphasis on racial equity is highlighted across all elements of the framework and highlighted explicitly here. Breaking it down one more level, we have our predictors. So under each pillar is a set of key predictors for mobility from poverty. These are evidence-based factors that are strongly associated with the likelihood that a community can create the conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of residents while also narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. The predictors were chosen by the working group after a really rigorous, thorough review of academic research around factors that strongly influence mobility from poverty. We ended up with 24 predictors that cover diverse aspects of community, cover all stages of the life cycle, and can be influenced by state and local policy. And now we come to the mobility metrics. So for each predictor, the working group selected a metric that can be used to compare and monitor a community's performance in relation to that predictor over time. Basically, the mobility metrics are just our way to take an aspect of the predictor and make it actionable. And while no data source is perfect, we aim to select metrics that balance a variety of considerations. We also wanted to quickly preview some ways that users can utilize the metrics. This will be explored further in our next session, which will focus specifically on the mobility metrics. But just quickly running through, the metrics can be used to compare a community's metrics to peer communities to assess the extent of local mobility challenges and build public support for tackling it. Users can also use them to reveal persistent racial inequities and the structural barriers that perpetuate them. They can prioritize mobility predictors where the community's focused attention and action can have the greatest impact. The metrics can also be used to highlight interconnections among predictors from different policy domains to break down silos, recruit partners, and identify the roles different actors can play. Users can use it to set targets for improving local mobility metrics and narrowing inequities as part of a strategy for meaningful change in investments, policies, and practices. And finally, the metrics can be used to monitor them over time to assess a community's progress and also hold local stakeholders accountable. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Arzo to review how to access the mobility metrics data tables and some other resources.
Great, thanks, Gabby. Hi, everybody. My name is Arzo Azizi. I'm a policy analyst with the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. And like Gabby mentioned, I'll be briefly walking you through how to access your community's mobility metrics data tables. And wanted to preview that at the next session, the mobility metrics session, which will build off of today's workshop, we'll take a closer look at the data tables and actually walk through the different tabs available in more detail and more. And so with that, the first step to accessing your data tables will be to navigate to the data tab. So there are a couple ways that you can do this today if you wanted to follow along. You can scan this QR code to get to the data tab on the project website, or they just dropped a link in the chat, which is visiting upward-mobility.urban.org/data. And then another way, if you're familiar with the Upward Mobility website, is to navigate to the center tab labeled data in the header, and that will take you to this page. And so the page will look just like this, and it'll say measuring upward mobility in counties and cities across the US. And so I'll just pause for a second in case people are finding their way there. Just give it a moment. Great. I'm sure people are still going, but I'll just slowly be moving along. Once you're on that page, there is a video tutorial a little bit further down that you can watch that will guide you through all the main features of the data tables in case you wanted to learn more ahead of our next session or even review what we are discussing today. And so that lives on that page for your reference. And then after that is a little bit further down the page, and this is where you can actually start the search for your community. So you can scroll down and it'll say, select a county or city to explore your community's mobility metrics. And so the first step here is for you to decide which of the geography makes the most sense for your needs. You might ask yourself, what jurisdiction is the one where I have the most influence? Or which policies at what level of geography most impact me and my work in my community? Or even where do I currently live and work and want to learn a little bit more about? And so with that answer in mind, you can select the state that you're in. And once you select your state, an additional search bar will open for you to select your community. And so for counties, we have data tables available for all counties in the United States. And then we have data tables available for cities with a population greater than 75,000. If you represent a smaller city, we recommend looking for your corresponding county for the data table to use as a sort of proxy. So once you select your city or county, a button will show up that says View Data Tables. And when you click that, the data tables will appear in a new tab in your browser and your search will remain in your existing tab. And so this is an example of how the data table page will appear. So every community data page has a navigation tool on the left, which is labeled on this page, and it has the pillars listed below. But the page also has a continuous scroll. So if you just start scrolling down, you'll be able to access your mobility metrics and the data table. So that was a really brief overview of how to access your community's mobility metrics data tables. And now I'm just going to walk through some examples of how communities have used the upward mobility framework and also point you to some resources in case you're looking for a way to apply the framework in your work. Okay. So earlier today, Gabby mentioned the upward mobility cohort, which is a cohort that we partnered with from 2020 to 2022 to test the utility of the framework and the mobility metrics. And at the end of the 18 months of technical assistance, each team from that cohort published a mobility action plan, which outlined a set of strategic actions that they'll take to boost mobility from poverty in their community. And so they're publicly available for folks if you'd like to check them out. And Katie just dropped a link in the chat for your reference. Another resource that builds off of this work in 2022 is the Planning Guide for Local Action. So the urban team released the planning guide intending to assist municipalities and their partners in boosting upward mobility from poverty in their community. So the guide offers a sort of jumping off point for people wondering where to start, and it outlines a roadmap of steps for doing the work. And it's a really comprehensive planning process and walks you through steps involving building a cross-sector team, gathering and analyzing data, conducting community and stakeholder engagement, and identifying needed systems change to boost mobility from poverty and advancing equity in your community, all of which was built off of lessons learned from the counties involved in the upward mobility cohort. And I'll just say that personally, I think the guide offers a lot of tangible tools like worksheets and checklists, and also links out to resources from other organizations to supplement all the resources that are already within the guide as well. Great. And so now I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples from the upward mobility cohort. As we sort of been talking about today, community engaged methods have been core to our approach as they bring residents into every stage of the planning process to help set priorities and not just to provide feedback at the end. And so many of our counties chose to hold data walks, like Gabby mentioned, which uses data sharing as the foundation for collaboration. And for anyone who might not be familiar with the data walk, residents are able to move through a presentation of posters with information about their communities. And this could look like data tables or charts or infographics, and are offered a space to react and discuss what they see with the facilitators. And so these types of open conversations about the data can empower community members and residents to explore conditions in their community and identify the gaps in services or the programs that could be strengthened. I think most importantly, a data walk can offer a space for community members to push back on the data and if the data does not reflect their lived experience. And so an example of a data walk that we saw was in Boone County, Missouri, who used the results-based accountability framework to help set goals for their work. And then they held a data walk that presented both the mobility metrics that we've been discussing and also local data to the community members. And from that, they selected 3 priority issues, which were early grade literacy, fair and inclusive housing, and jobs and workforce development. And so to advance the work in these areas, Boone then set up 3 work groups led by local community member facilitators. And these work groups identified key strategic actions in the 3 areas of focus, such as improving wraparound services for young children, increasing second chance leasing opportunities, and implementing upwardly mobile business practices. Another example of centering community voices that we saw was in Summit County, Ohio. The Mobility Coalition there used an existing annual pulse survey to ask about community priorities. And then they did a second survey with people experiencing hardships to get their perspectives on proposed areas of focus. So this resulted in an action plan centered on mental health and juvenile justice, seeking a holistic approach to improve outcomes for adolescents. And so those are just a couple of examples of the framework in practice. And before we open it up for questions, since that was a bit of information, I just wanted to point you all to the resources that we mentioned today. These will all be included in the follow-up and the slides as well. But it'll be like a one-stop shop for all of the links that were in the chat, including the Upward Mobility Framework, the Exemplar Research Report, the Mobility Action Plan, the Planning Guide for Local Action, and the Mobility Metrics data tables. I also wanted to point you to other resources we have available. There are a ton of research reports and existing research on the Upward Mobility website. We also have the Evidence Resource Library, which is all the literature that we have that points to why we selected the 24 predictors that we did. And we also have a blog, which we're constantly posting more about the framework on. And for example, about 2 months ago, we posted this blog, How Policymakers Can Use Measures of Mobility from Poverty Affected by the COVID-19 Pandemic. And like we've been plugging throughout today and in the chat, there will be a future training building off of this one called the Mobility Metrics Workshop, which will take a deeper dive into the metrics and accessing the data tables and making sense of the information available, while also discussing how to analyze and leverage the metrics to achieve your upward mobility and racial equity goals. You'll also notice that there is an email address up on the screen, upwardmobility@urban.org if you needed to reach a member of the team or ask any follow-up questions. But with that, I will now open it up for questions, since I know that was a lot of information, and I believe I can pass it back to Will.
Thanks so much, Arzo. Yeah, that was a lot of information in about 35 minutes, covering years worth of work from a number of folks at Urban and other organizations. So I imagine there might be questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or also this actually is open for folks if they want to speak directly. Folks are able to. If you could just please use the raise hand function if possible. That should be towards the bottom right of your screen. There's like 3 dots. If that says more under it, if you click it, raise hand is one of the options for doing so. And then we can ask folks to jump in that way as well. But in the meantime, oh, great, Jim, I see a question. Go ahead.
Sure, let me at least put myself on video. I'm sort of curious how you think or communicate around the notion that systemic poverty is more of a systemic feature than a bug. And at the same time, sort of local solutions around local control. And so how do you counsel and coach communities that are both looking at place-based and sort of hyper-localized interventions and strategies while sort of grappling with the larger embedded, again, features and not bugs of a system that has been well designed to maintain economic disparities, et cetera?
I can take a first pass at this and then open it to y'all. I think that's definitely something that when we were doing the direct work with counties came up a lot. One thing that we did with those groups early on is do like stakeholder mapping and also plan mapping, program mapping, to really get a sense of like what is actually in the control of the county or the city and who's holding certain levers. Because while we are all within, bigger and bigger circles of power where we just get more abstract, there's also a lot that like a city or a county government does have control over that can have really material impacts in people's lives. So I think that's kind of where we focus is, there's a bigger battle for like nationwide or global system change, but then there's also the battle for hyper local systems change and kind of what's happening directly in your neighborhood. So really, when you focus too big, it can get scary. And so when you focus smaller and really in your community, that's where I think we're able to like come up with really creative solutions to move the needle on some of the metrics.
And I would just add on top of that, local policy and local work that needs to be done to address mobility from poverty or address any social issue is a system in itself. So localities are certainly systemic challenges that need to be addressed. And in some ways or explicitly, the development of the predictors and the metrics, which we're going to be talking about in a lot more detail at the next training, are attempting to help understand how the system's operating and identify ways to try to address particular deficits or challenges that all contribute to this systemic approach. So I think in some ways, many folks working on this project are thinking about the local ecosystems as systems themselves. Does that answer your question?
That's great. Thanks. Appreciate it.
And I see a question came in the chat around how often will the data be updated, and Arzo answered it, but Arzo, if you wouldn't mind just elaborating a bit.
Yeah, I can overview that aloud. So the data tables will be updated again in spring of 2024, so very soon. And we're hoping to update them annually. That just sort of depends on capacity and how the source data sort of looks like. But all updates will be announced on the website and also social media platforms. And I can also drop a link in the chat about if you wanted to register for updates about the project. That's another way you'll be able to find out about updates. And this might be a good place to plug that we are also hoping to create a data dashboard, which will offer a visual aid in terms of looking at the data tables, and also will be able to view more years of data on the data dashboard. And so that is all in the pipeline and something to look forward to, but I will drop that link for updates in case folks want to sign up.
Thanks, Arzo. And just wanted to put in one more comment to Jim's previous question around systemic approaches to local change. The link was put in the chat, but I want to highlight the upward mobility planning guide in particular. And Gabby may have mentioned this, but it definitely is a mapped out approach to navigating some of the systemic challenges and coalition building and stakeholder gathering and using data to define and then measure change approaches that folks are taking. So encourage people to look at that in particular. Okay. Yes, I see Junius, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, if you want to come off mute. And then I see Rocio, again, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, to come off mute next. And then there's some questions in the chat, sorry, that we can get to as well.
I'm wondering how you're addressing the framework around alternative economies. There's a lot of activity going on in my region around rejection of capitalism and the current kind of economic structure, and that being the underlying problem. So how are you dealing with that tension that part of the community is saying the fundamental structure is wrong, we need to abandon it, and they're out trying to develop a new alternative economic structure? How is that working out in play in your pilot sites?
I can take a first stab at this, and then Gabby and Arzo, feel free to chime in. But one of the benefits to addressing that question potentially to the three-part definition is that we're not defining upward mobility as specifically just economic mobility or mobility out of poverty based on economic capital gain, et cetera. We're also focusing on belonging and community and power and autonomy, and a number of these predictors that we touched on just briefly are aiming to think about social gains, societal approaches, systemic approaches beyond economic success that can hopefully help to address some ways to move out of poverty within a capitalistic structure. It doesn't address alternative economies and maybe exactly the way that you're talking about it, but it is broader than thinking about our economic approach, specifically in terms of the way that we're thinking about how to grow and sustain and build mobility from poverty. Gabby?
Yeah, I would just add on that with the way the three-part definition is structured and the way that the metrics are, it isn't inherently aligned with a single way to approach the economy or a single way to view economic transition. And so it can be, interpreted by many different people in many different ways. I'd also say that the metrics themselves usually are used to address systems more than structures. So it's like you can't look at the systems without looking at the impact of structural capitalism and racial capitalism. Like there's just no way to look at inequity without acknowledging those things. Usually that's for like the local communities we've worked with about that's incorporated into their analysis, but they're also looking at the systems beneath that. So looking at systems of housing, systems of healthcare, systems of education. And for folks that are engaged in like anti-capitalist work, they can have a very different kind of next step plan than other groups would.
Thanks. Tough question. Appreciate it. Very helpful. And thanks, Gabby. And yeah, passing it on to Rocio. Again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Oh, good. Hi, I'm Rocio. So I'm from the county of Sonoma. I'm part of the county government. I think I had a comment and a question. The comment is, I think this is really great because it kind of shows some of the like next steps, like what do we do with the data and how can we there's a lot of work that we're doing internally around health equity. And so like we have the portrait of Sonoma, we were part of the Measure of America, we have the portrait of Sonoma County. And so some of the questions that come out of it is like, well, now what? And so I feel like this can be part of like our planning of like the now what. So thank you for that great work. And then the question that I have is we have been doing a lot of data collection around Sonoma County, a lot of our own needs assessments. So are any of the primary data collection that we do as the county, like could that be included as part of the metrics on the website? Is that like, well, anyway, that's my question. Like, can that be included as part of the bucket of evidence?
So others chime in, but thank you for that comment. And the question, the mobility metrics data table that Arzo quickly went through, that's up on the website. And quick plug, if you haven't heard it a couple times already, we'll be talking in a lot more detail about the development of those metrics and the data tables and everything at the April 25th training. But those are developed with an eye to them being available for every single county in the United States, ideally. And with that idea, we were looking for data sets that could be used nationally where possible. Not all of them were utilized. And so we're relying on national data sets, census data, other types of data sets for populating that. So that tool is with the intention of having data that can be used across various counties and not county specific data. So that was a long way of saying, no, that's not the purpose of that tool of having specific county data points that are put up there. But with that said, it's something that we often encourage folks to do. And so it's great to hear that Sonoma has this, is to go a little bit deeper than what we have up on our website, because the purpose of what's on the website is to share data that could be accessed across counties and cities of 75,000 people or more. We had to select only certain data sets that were available to everyone. We highly encourage folks to partner with local universities or work with data analysts in their jurisdictions to look at data that might be more useful or more descriptive of some of the predictors and some of the challenges that you're facing that you can gather locally. So it's great that you all are doing that, and we encourage you to do that. That's just not the purpose, I guess, if you will, of this national set of data that we have.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, and someone put in the chat that public health epidemiologist might be another great source of data, which is appreciated. Okay, we had a question come in, and then I'm going to try to get to, there are a couple other questions that have come in the chat as well that we will try to get to. So first, question for Gabby, maybe, who talked through this a bit. And you've touched on this already a little bit, but if a community is interested in using this framework and planning process in their specific jurisdiction, what advice do you have for them on how to get started in doing so?
Yeah, for sure. So step one is kind of just familiarizing yourself with the metrics, and y'all have already done that. So check on your way. In our planning guide, it's a very methodical kind of like 10-step process of what planning can look like. And so we definitely encourage like the first step being to visit the planning guide and give it a read through with an eye to your specific organization or community, and see where like your points of like strength might be in relation to it, or where some additional capacity may be needed. The first step that we include in the planning guide, beyond just familiarizing yourself with the framework through something like this webinar, is taking some time to like really go through your community's metrics, and just going through those and seeing what feels aligned with your understanding of the community, what feels surprising to see, what is upholding something that you know but don't have a data point for, and just starting there to kind of jumpstart the process of kind of, diagnostics or case making.
Great. Thanks so much. There is a question in the chat from Cole that says, can you talk a bit more about how many county cities you've encountered have the capacity to measure and act on this framework? So kind of building in some ways off of what Gabby was just talking about, how advanced or common are the data gathering analysis skills that would be needed? And then a couple other points in there. And that's a great question, and huge variation and variability depending on county size and resources and such. This is certainly a challenge for a lot of jurisdictions that don't necessarily have a large capacity of staff that are data minded or data focused. We have done trainings in the past that has really dived deeply into how to access some of the data sets and navigate them and analyze them in a way that the counties can do themselves. But we've also worked in the past, in recent years, to provide fairly in-depth technical assistance to jurisdictions on how to analyze that data themselves. And counties have a wide range of ability to do so and staffing to do so. So That was a lot to say. Some counties are really well set up and do have the staff on board to analyze this data. And like, as you heard from Sonoma and others, some counties are actively looking at this data. And this is just a way to think about framing it in terms of approaches that can be used to create change. Others need help analyzing the data, staffing that, and that's where we encourage folks to partner and jurisdictions to partner with local universities and others. Kevin?
I would just add that this project, even though it's been going on for several years, in terms of something with as big a scale as upward mobility, it's definitely early days, and we're currently exploring a bunch of different ways to provide resources and access to technical assistance for communities of varying capacities. And so the metrics themselves are one way to make a bunch of publicly available data that if you didn't have something like the metrics, you would need a data analyst to go through and comb those numbers out. That's one way working to kind of fill that capacity gap. But also the resources we have on our website, whether it be guides or blogs, are also kind of striving to do that. So definitely there are cases where folks have needed, for their specific intervention, have needed to find a way to boost their data capacity. But I would just say that we're exploring different ways to kind of help fill that, whether or not there's like a person dedicated to the data.
And there was a question that came in earlier, thanks Gabby, around food insecurity and why it's specifically not under one of the metrics or the predictors in particular. And others should feel free to chime in. And Gabby, I see you came off mute, but I would just quickly mention that each of the metrics and the predictors are very directly sourced in evidence that shows that they do tie to economic success, belongingness, or each of the autonomy and approaches there. And so each of them were selected for that purpose of directly tying to one of those in terms of access to health services, college access, coping with stress, et cetera. And so it's possible that the evidence that we were able to find as available didn't necessarily tie to one of those predictors. And there's also information up on our website in terms of the methodology of how that was determined. But that's something we can also circle back on and potentially talk about during the next training when we talk in more detail on the metrics around why some and some were not selected in terms of that process. And we will be going into that a bunch more on the next training. Gabby?
Yeah, food insecurity is one that folks have asked about before. I think it's because it's a really urgent issue in a lot of communities. A lot of times, and like Will said, there's a ton of resources going through the history of the methodology, what the selection process looked like, because there's, probably thousands of metrics you could probably use that are related because mobility is so complex. But there were seven criteria that our team used to determine what metrics would be included. And so it honestly might be more because of what the quality or the access of the data source itself would be, and like being able to find a nationally available metric to measure food insecurity. And it would need to be something that could be repeated at regular intervals, so like tracked on a yearly or biannual basis, something that could be accessible whether you were in an urban area or a rural area, and data that could be racially disaggregated. So those are all considerations that the team took into account when selecting metrics. And with something like food insecurity, I believe it was because we weren't able to locate a data source that both, like Will said, fit into our definition squarely, but also that fit those important data characteristics in order to be used. So that's another thing where I would just say we emphasize over and over again that there's no substitute for local data. The metrics are a great starting point, but supplementing that with local work and local knowledge is really essential. And looking at the factors that are associated with food insecurity, whether even if it's not food insecurity itself, looking at neighborhood metrics and health metrics can be a useful starting point for going deeper into food insecurity.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, and apologies for the delay in getting it to it. But thanks, Gabby. Yeah, that's a great point just about the lens that we bring to this, and we can't highlight it enough. And we just did of a national lens, trying to think systemically that localities can use, but we are coming from the perspective of thinking about measurable metrics over time that can be used across jurisdictions. And so we are tied to the data availability that we can find that is evidence-based and measurable. So appreciate that. Oh, and thank you, Gabby, for putting the methodology link in the chat. And please do feel free to reach out if you have follow-up questions. I imagine you might on some of the specifics. We've provided email information to reach out to and a scan that you can take for a survey on feedback on our approach. And then also definitely encourage folks to come to the forthcoming trainings, which we'll be talking a lot more about the specifics of this data. And we can make sure to address some of the specific questions that have come up today as well. I'll just very quickly go to one question that we passed over, and then we can wrap up, which I think was just around, I'm having trouble finding it now, but was around the age rate of people 55 and older, or the age of people 55 and older having high poverty rates, and how we account for that in the mobility metrics. Generally, I don't know, Gabby or Arzo, if you'd like to field that question. But I can just mention quickly that the mobility metrics, where possible, can all be disaggregated by age and demographics. So not just focusing on age, but something that folks can potentially look at and examine their local data by age differences across all of these metrics, which are across all of these various predictors and definitions, not just focusing on poverty, but autonomy and belongingness and predictors associated with those as well across age ranges. Gabby?
Yeah, I would just add that in the metric sheets themselves, just due to they're already very long documents, we don't offer all possible disaggregations in that sheet, but we do have a GitHub repository that has like the original info for all of that data. So if you have somebody that is able to code and use that, a lot of it's census data. So like Will said, it'll have those breakdowns by age and other demographics. So you can find the age breakdown for a lot of those.
Well, putting in a last plug to just take the brief survey on this training and to sign up for the next training on April 25th, if you have not. And with that, thank you all so much for joining. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. This training will be posted online. It will be shared out with everybody that attended and signed up. And thank you for the kind comments in the chat as well. Have a great day, everybody.